First of all, I would like to thank Fabrizio Baldassari and Fabio Zampieri for organizing this international colloquium on Cartesian medicine and for inviting me to participate. I can hardly imagine the difficulties you must have had in organizing this event, given the sanitary context. And before I begin, let me specify that due to the confinement currently in force in France, I have not been able to access John Cottingham's edition of Descartes. Therefore, the translation of his works into English are mine and not those of reference. And I thank once more Fabrizio for taking care of my PowerPoint that I can't scroll by myself on my laptop. So next slide, please. Thank you. The starting point for my intervention is the original concept of animal instinct that Descartes developed in his early physiological work. It is a strictly mechanical tendency to pursue the advantages, commoda, of the body and to flee the disadvantages, incommoda. This tendency is defined as a certain disposition of the brain that directs the animal spirits and therefore the reaction of the body when encountering external bodies. What is at stake in my study is the implication from the medical point of view of the adjunction to this first explanation of the consideration of the mind, which is united to the human body. The textual fact, which is crucial in this respect, is located in the Meditatio Sexta, when Descartes reintroduces, in the examination of the relation between feeling and the conservation of the health, he reintroduces the vocabulary of commoda et incommoda, and he mentions the valetudo, or health, santé in French, of the human body, as well as homo sanus. The philosophical stake of this talk begins to appear here. If the bodily instinct, which the human being shares in common with animals, aims to avoid the disadvantages of the body and to pursue the advantages, what role remains to the mind, the mens, in the human composite, relatively to the search of the good of the body? Let's clarify the question. The introduction of the mind in the analysis adds the fact that the perceptions of the senses signify the presence of advantages to the mind, and thus the fact that the mind is able to recognize or notice commoda and incommoda. As Descartes himself says, anyone that has a little intelligence can acknowledge what is useful to his or her health, provided that he or she pays a little attention to it. But if a strictly corporeal process is able to make us avoid disadvantages and on the contrary pursue advantages, it seems that the addition of the mind is in this respect perfectly superfluous. If, as a body, the human being can by instinct flee from disadvantages and pursue advantages, how can we understand that nature has given the human being sensitive perceptions so that the mind can be signified, the commoda et incommoda encountered by the compound of which it is a part? So the first part of my talk will deal with animal instinct and health conservation. Next slide, please, Fabrizio. Thank you. The first step in my demonstration will be to establish the existence of a concept of animal instinct in the text of the 1630s relative to physiology. And I will propose to determine the notion of commodum and incommodum and the concept of health that is attached to this. So I will deal relatively quickly with animal instinct, for I proposed a first introduction to this concept during a previous symposium on the Cartesian brain, in which some of the speakers gathered here took part. what I want to say is that Descartes mentions the existence of an instinct that human beings as bodies and animals have in common in a letter to Mersenne from October the 16th in 1639. And several texts from the 1630s attempt to thematize this concept. Animal instinct is a natural disposition of the brain that has the role of leading the spirits, which are moved by some particular action, to all the nerves where they have to go, to produce the movements of fleeing from the disadvantages and of pursuing the advantages of the body. It thus imposes on animal spirits a single path to produce an immediate reaction following the encounter with an external body. The natural disposition of the brain, which differs from the one that results from the repeated encounters of similar objects, thus plays the role of instinct. It is a certain organization of the body, thanks to which Descartes does not break with his mechanistic explanation of animal movements. It's an organization of the body that explains the immediate, almost invariable reaction and independent of any form of prior knowledge that follows from the encounter with external bodies. The explanation of the animal instinct, and more broadly of all the movements of animals and human beings as bodies, is based on a fundamental relationship, commoditas, commodité in French. It must now be determined. First, the definitional effort to be made is not insignificant. It's not enough to substitute for the Latin commodum incommodum a couple of names which alone would exhaust its meaning. For example, useful, harmful, convenient, disconvenient, good or evil. In Descartes' work, it's possible to distinguish several meanings of the vocabulary of commode, incommode, in both French and Latin. In the broadest sense, a commodum is anything that facilitates an action, and an incommodum is what hinders the performance of an action. But there is a use of this notion in a strictly physical context. For a given inert body, commodité seems to designate the absence of resistance of the surrounding bodies to the fact that the inert body perseveres in its same state. But insofar as Descartes claims to explain inert and living bodies according to the same principles, the term of commodum and incommodum should not be that equivocal when it comes to the considerations of living bodies. So in the first approach, we can say that for a living body, something is commode that comes into contact with it and is favorable to the conservation of its life. But it feels like this is still saying too little. Descartes is indeed more precise. First of all, on the subject of the advantages and disadvantages of nature, commoda naturae vel incommoda, that affect animals, Descartes says that they can refer either to singular parts or to the whole of the body. He notes that, so I translated a short quotation from the Cogitationes circa generationem animalium. Descartes notes that when the senses show something advantageous to the whole, the movement which produces the sense immediately produces all the movements in the other limbs to enjoy these advantages. If they show something advantageous to one part only and disadvantageous to another, this movement which is felt determines the animal spirits to make all the possible movements in one part by which one enjoys this advantage, and in the other, all the movements by which one flees from this disadvantage. And I realized that I've forgotten to ask Fabrizio to go to the next slide. Thank you very much. Descartes also states that animals have been exposed when they were in the uterus to commoda and incommoda by which they grew up and which impelled them to certain movements. He also states that whenever something similar happens to them afterwards, they carry out these same movements. Finally, it should be noted that the concept of commodum and incommodum is not accompanied in the physiological text by the concept of health. In other words, Descartes does not think of the health of the body through the concept of advantage or disadvantage of the body. The term santé is absent from l'homme. The terms sanitas and valetudo are absent from cogitationes circa generationem animalium. So from these textual elements, it appears first that commodité is a relationship that involves contact of the living body with some of the bodies that surround it. No body is objectively and without exception an advantage or a disadvantage. The same flame can be disadvantageous for a hand if this hand is already hot or simply too close to the fire. And it can be advantageous for it if the hand is cold and at a good distance. By this same example, taken from l'homme, we can see that the advantage cannot be reduced to what directly preserves the principle of life, namely the warmth of the heart. It can in fact concern the whole body or some of its parts without any exclusivity for the heart. Something will therefore be incommodum for a living body if it threatens to destroy or damage one of its parts or to attenuate the warmth of the heart. On the contrary, a thing will be commodum for a living body if it is capable of maintaining the warmth of the heart, the good constitution of the limbs, or the structure of the whole machine, an expression that I took from l'homme. And insofar as they are exhibited by the senses, commoda and incommoda are differentiated by a certain type of action on the nerves of these sense organs. For the former, the movement is temperate or moderate. It is strong or violent in the case of the latter. Then it is, to conclude on this point, it is understandable that commoda encountered in extrauterine life are only similar and not perfectly identical to those of intrauterine life. In the uterus, the incommoda are undifferentiated foods and not separate objects, which are directly assimilated by the body via the umbilical cord, and which directly promotes the warmth of the heart. In extrauterine existence, the commoda to be pursued are exterior to the living body, with which the contact is therefore external. So this is why commoda and incommoda are just similar in the intrauterine life and in the extrauterine life. Now I'll deal with the second part of my talk, the status of the incommoda and the valetudo in the sixth meditation. Thank you for the slide, Fabrizio. So far, the notion of animal instinct and its correlative concept, the commodum and incommodum, have been clarified. The latter designates a fundamental relationship between every living body and some of the bodies that surround it.
No.
The textual fact on which I would now like to insist is Descartes' use of the same vocabulary of commodum incommodum in the examination of the union of soul and body that he proposes in the sixth meditation. One of the important theses of the sixth meditation is well known. The senses does not teach me the essence of the bodies around me, but on the one hand, that there is a variety in the bodies that responds to the variety of perception that I have of them. And on the other hand, the perceptions of the senses teach me that my body, or rather myself as a whole, as I am composed of body and soul, can receive various advantages or disadvantages from the other bodies that surround it. Descartes rephrases it: the perceptions of the senses have been given to me by nature to signify to the mind that certain advantages or disadvantages happen to the compound of which it is a part. And to that extent, they are quite clear and distinct. So the question is, why signify to the mind the advantages and disadvantages when the human body can by itself instinctively pursue the former and flee the latter? So first, Descartes reintroduces in the Sixth Meditation the vocabulary of commodum and incommodum. Are we dealing with the same concept that I determined before? A reticence could arise when one considers Descartes himself seems to hesitate. He first asserts that it is my body that can be affected by commoda and incommoda because of the bodies that surround it. And he says then that it's rather me as a whole, as a compound of mind and body. Has commoditas ceased to characterize an exclusively corporeal relationship? It does not seem so. Just a few lines before mentioning myself as a whole, Descartes refused the image of the pilot in his ship. The idea is that the damage to the body is not seen from the outside by the spirit, but through unpleasant feelings. Thus, the mind is engaged as part of the compound when advantages or disadvantages occur, in the sense that they manifest themselves to it in a particular way. And I could add that if a part of the compound of a compound is affected by an advantage, this also applies to the whole compound by definition. So it must therefore be said that the Meditatio Sexta contains the same concept of commodum and incommodum that the one that was used in physiology. The human body to which a spirit is united is affected by commodum or incommodum in the sense I have previously defined. A definitive certainty has therefore been reached here. It is true that the commentators often point at the medical knowledge that arises in the Meditatio Sexta. It breaks up the Ordo Meditandi insofar as it is a knowledge that was not previously attained in the course of Cartesian metaphysical meditation. Though this is a well-known point in the secondary literature, I claim to have reached an additional certainty. The very concept of incommodum is also a notion of Cartesian physiology that was transposed into metaphysics. The second important fact that I would like to comment on is the introduction in the Meditatio Sexta of the vocabulary of valetudo and sanitas, santé in French, which constitutes a discrepancy when we compare it with the physiological text and the context, the use in the physiological text of the concept of commodum. Two remarks can be made. First of all, if nature has instituted the perceptions of the senses in such a way that they signify present incommoda or commoda to the mind, it is not that the mind can compete for the survival of the body. Perhaps the body would do better on its own. The mind is indeed, in this respect, a source of potential error. Second remark, the preservation of health, as opposed to survival, implies a relationship to the commoda and incommoda that goes beyond the immediate reaction to their presence or their impression or the impression, sorry, that they make on the body. The conservation of the health implies that one must be prepared in advance for the encounter of disadvantages and not just turn away from them when they occur. So we can now better understand what the mind can do with regard to the body and the commodum. The action of the animal or human body in the face of commoda and incommoda depends on their action on the nerves and their sense organs. So the movement is thus necessarily a reaction. Conversely, the introduction of the mens adds the possibility of anticipation with regard to the future. It introduces the possibility that our behavior with regard to commoda and incommoda is not pure reaction in the present time, but prospecting and forecasting. This is how the experience of commoda and incommoda will differ between human beings and animals. And this will open up the possibility for the human being to become a doctor of himself or herself. To conclude now, I just deal with one possible objection. One could say that survival and conservation of the health are not distinguished according to temporality, because the perception of the senses occur while the human being encounters incommoda. Moreover, when you train an animal, it learns to behave well before it is punished. So through the example of training, it seems that there is a relation to the future also in animal behavior. But in fact, and that will be my conclusion, the perceptions of the senses allow the mind to organize the conduct of life independently from the reaction to an actual stimulus. And when you study training, what is at stake is still an actual stimulus. Well, I have already reached the time that was mine. So this is it for me.
If you want to conclude, if you want to.
Okay, well, a short sentence. In this talk, I have proposed a study on the relation of commoditas and incommoditas in Descartes' work, from the physiological text of the 1630s to the Meditatio Sexta of 1641. I have shown that the term does not change its meaning in both of these contexts. I then try to demonstrate that if the perceptions of the senses signify the present commoda and incommoda to the mind, it is not for the mind to participate in the survival of the body, but so that knowledge can recapture them and anticipates the future. Thank you.